So let's keep moving through some kind of basic cardiovascular system anatomy. As I'm up here freezing, my hands are incredibly cold today. So we were talking about heart rate and the cardiac conduction system yesterday, how we generate a heartbeat, how it travels right around the heart. We talked about the electrocardiogram. We talked about systole and diastole and some places where we're getting contraction and relaxation. Okay. So the next variable that I want us to cover, heart rate's important. I don't want to say that it's not important, okay? Because it is. But as it relates to exercise, especially as it relates to kind of maximal exercise responses and things, stroke volume, we can make an argument that stroke volume is even more important. Okay, it's going to help us separate which one of you is going to be a good endurance person from somebody that's not, in a way that maybe heart rate's not. Okay, so stroke volume is the amount of blood that's ejected from the left ventricle every time it beats. Okay. We haven't talked about it yet, but cardiac output is a similar-ish kind of thing, but the units are similar but not quite the same. My undergrads have a hard time with this. Okay, they always confuse stroke volume and cardiac output. So stroke volume is what leaves the left ventricle into the aorta each time the heart beats. So what you're getting in basically in milliliters of volume, okay, every beat. Whereas cardiac output is heart rate multiplied by stroke volume. So it's a volume of blood, but it's per some unit of time. Okay? So stroke volume is just sort of one thing. So at rest, stroke volume is in an average size kind of college age person, somewhere between maybe 70 and 100 milliliters. Okay. So you look in several exercise physics books and say it's 82 milliliters at rest. I don't really know how we can think that we're going to be quite that precise. Okay. So I used to use this as an example, and I need to get a new example. How many of you guys, I'm going to date myself here. How many of you guys have ever used a camera that took actual 35 millimeter film that you had to load into the camera? Christina has. Not like a disposable thing if you had at a wedding reception or something like, oh, that has 35 millimeter film in it, okay? But like you actually have a 35 millimeter camera, you had to load the film. Anybody ever had to develop film in like a dark room? Just Christina? Okay. So when I was in college, you could take a photography class. And if you had your own camera, you like learn how to actually develop film in the darkroom and things. Well, 35 millimeter film used to come in these little black cylinders that had a gray top that you put on. They're about yay tall and about maybe an inch and a half in diameter, these little bitty cylinders. If you filled those things up with a fluid, that would be somewhere between about 80 and 100 milliliters of a fluid that would fit in there, which is fine because it used to be that everybody had taken pictures with 35 millimeter camera. I remember when we got our first ever digital camera, right when my wife and I got married, which was in 2003, for you kids keeping score at home. We got a digital camera. That camera was like your iPhone if you like covered up one of the things on the iPhone and you really couldn't focus it in those kinds of ways. We were like, this is the coolest thing we've ever seen. Like you just take a picture, you have to develop the picture, you can download them, and you could put like 5 in a little memory stick. Anyway, so before phones were awesome. That's about what 80 milliliters is. Okay. We have, and we'll see in probably not today, but Monday, we have an ability to manipulate what's happening with stroke volume. Okay. I can do something to Brady and make his stroke volume go up. And the extent to which you can increase your stroke volume. Okay. is going to be really, really dependent upon, or really predictive of your aortic nurse capacity. So this terminology of things can be somewhat confusing. All right, so we're going to say that stroke volume is equal to end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. And these two things, and thinking about it in this way, become important because we're going to have some effects of exercise and other things on each one of these two things. And so therefore, that's going to have an effect on our overall stroke volume. So end diastolic volume is just what it says. It's the volume of blood in the left ventricle at the end of diastole. So it's at the end of the period of time when the left ventricle is relaxed and it's allowing blood to fill in. Okay, that's peak blood in the left ventricle. In systolic volume is just what it says. It's how much blood's left in the left ventricle at the end of system or ventricular system. Okay, so I have blood. All right, we're going from the left. Here for my people that are on, I don't even know if they can see me. Woo. Here we go. Okay, I have my left ventricle. I'm going, and then I have my left atria. Assume there's nothing in my ventricle or very little, right? Blood gets dumped into the ventricle from the atria and it fills up to some point, okay? It's going to reach some point. So here we have some hand sanitizer in here, all right? And then I'm going to begin to contract the left ventricle. So I'm going to squeeze it, okay? I'm going to squeeze it for some amount of time at some force, and that's going to force out some blood. So I'm going to pour the blood back out of here. There will be some amount that's left in here, okay? Right when I finish dumping from the left atria, right before I squeeze, that's in diastolic volume. Then I squeeze some out, and then I'm going to stop squeezing whatever's left in there. That's in systolic volume, okay? So it is in many ways, it's like dumping the blood from 2 cups kind of into each other. Okay, does that make sense, you guys? Y'all understand? Pardon?
Diastolic dump.
Yes. Did you just make that up, Christina?
No, that's literally what I'm hearing from you.
Oh, well, I'm dumping from the left atria. Anyway, so there we go. All right, Christina's having some, she's thinking of cardiovascular parameters here in ways that make sense. Okay, so if we know what's in there before it contracts and you know how much is left after it contracts, then obviously the difference in those two things is what is left out of the aorta. Okay, these are going to become really important because we can potentially manipulate in diastolic volume. And we can also manipulate in systolic volume for a couple of reasons. And if we change one of those or both, then that can have some effects on my systolic or on my stroke volume. Okay. There's another parameter that is more commonly used in clinical settings. It's called ejection fraction. Okay. You ever go and they do an echocardiograph on you, which my mom just had done a couple of weeks ago, then they can calculate for you something called ejection fraction. Ejection fraction is basically stroke volume, okay, divided by end diastolic volume. So how much of the blood in the heart or in the left ventricle at the end of diastole is being ejected every time. In a normal, healthy heart, and a person that's not hypertensive, that doesn't have congestive heart failure or anything else, okay, at rest, their ejection fraction is going to be roughly 67% at rest, okay? So what I want you all to take away from all of that is that generally at rest, there's still some blood left in your left ventricle, okay? Your heart beats, it ejects 2/3 of the blood, but about 1/3 is going to stay in there, okay? As we exercise in a healthy person, your ejection fraction is going to increase, okay? Your ejection fraction is going to increase. It may not ever get to be 100, but it should go up. Okay. But these are much more commonly used. So people that have congestive heart failure, or they have high blood pressure or something, their ejection fraction is going to be lower. Like it may be like under 50% or something. And that would tell us that there's probably some improper function. Either aortic pressure is too high, and so the left ventricle is not strong enough to be able to overcome aortic pressure enough to eject more blood than all of that, or there's weakening due to ischemic damage or something that's happened. But this is a thing that you may see in clinical kinds of things. We don't look at it a lot as an exercise physiologist just because it's hard for us to measure this while you're exercising. Okay, I'm going to put Cy on the treadmill and have him run while we're holding the Doppler probe over his heart, so we can try to image his image his left ventricle, and then we're going to have the sort of increase his speed and grade, and he's going to be flailing around at some point wanting to kill us while we're also holding the Doppler probe on him. Skillet, have you had to hold the Doppler probe yet?
We do it on farm.
I know, but like, have you had that experience?
Yes.
You put the electrode gel on there. It's, can you imagine if a person is sweaty and it wants to slide around a bit, and you've got to kind of keep it right at the exact right tilt. Left ventricle is a little easier to image than, say, like the brachial or the radial artery or something like all of that. But it can be a tricky thing. Okay, but you may come across that. I want you to understand what it is. Okay. So if we take heart rate, not for an echo. That's for an echo. Yeah, that's for an echo. Sorry. So Dr. Larson just had one. She had an echo done a couple of weeks ago as well. They had some interesting things going on with her sort of responses, and it turns out she's a genetic freak show, which we've known the whole time anyway. But she, anyway, so I got to see her echo responses. She was sharing some things with us. Like, they thought I had cardiovascular disease. She doesn't. But she's super duper fit, and so hers were pretty interesting. When she maxed out the stress test, she was not anywhere close to sort of maxing out ejection fraction. They're like, oh, you couldn't. The stress test doesn't make you work hard enough to actually be able to do some of those things, which is pretty cool. So, Christina.
So, the stress tests you're talking about are like physical stress tests?
Yeah, sorry, it's the Bruce protocol on the treadmill. So you start off walking at like 1.7 miles an hour at like an 8% grade or a 10% grade, and like every 3 minutes you increase the speed and the grade. They usually have the EKG on while you're doing all of this, and so you can do the stress test with an echo. Sometimes they'll even give you dye infusion and do the stress test with the EKG and the echo with the dye, and you can really try to image things in that particular way. Yeah.
So would the same occur with the chemical stress tests? So like those that can't physically do.
Or if you live in Oxford, Mississippi, even if you can do them, the cardiologist there is just like gives you I'm just going to give you the drugs anyway because I'm lazy and I don't want to treadmill. Yes, but you can do the same thing. Yes. So there are drugs. We won't talk about them, but there are drugs that they can infuse into you that will make your heart rate and your stroke volume go up, basically, as though you were doing a graded exercise test. And in people that they think can't walk on the treadmill or do the actual treadmill stress test, they can give them a pharmacological agent that will mimic those things. And the idea is what you're wanting to see with the stress test is how's heart rate, how's stroke volume, how's ejection fraction, right? How's perfusion in the heart? How are those things responding when we make the heart work much harder than it normally does at rest? Oftentimes, that increased work of the heart is going to make any sort of pathology become more manifest. You're going to see it easier during those kinds of things. Okay? It may bring on angina pain. If you've got blockages somewhere, you may be able to get enough blood to the heart at rest, but as soon as it has to start working harder, then the blockage is going to prevent the initial flow. So you may get angina pain, you may get dizziness, and those kinds of things. But yes, I've never seen a pharmacological one. We had students when I was at Ole Miss that they would go intern over there, and they would talk about like the people would describe it as like the weirdest. Like just imagine you're sitting there and you're just like having a progressive panic attack while you're sitting, and your heart's going to go and just kind of starts firing away. It seems bonkers to me, but that's what they do. Okay, Matt, you had another question? No, you're good?
I had a lot of things done to me, and I was wondering if I had a drug administered during the tilt test. Is that the same kind of drug?
I don't know. I mean, it could have been. It could have been. So, I mean, I'm just giving you epinephrine when we're doing a tilt test. But when we do a tilt test, we're measuring, it's not stuff we're going to talk about today, but we're measuring the ability of your blood vessels and things to respond properly to that change in posture to keep control of blood pressure.
Oh.
So you can maintain perfusion to the brain and to different places. So if they gave you stuff, then they're trying to sort of manipulate what's going on. They give it to you before you did the tilt test, or like before, yeah. So they may have given you a vasodilator or a vasoconstrictor or something. You don't remember what it was? They didn't tell you? Did you read the consent form?
Probably.
Probably, okay. So, all right, so cardiac output, okay? Cardiac output is the product of heart rate and stroke volume. What's this going on in the chat? So cardiac output is abbreviated as Q. Maybe somebody knows what the hell that means. It can't be obviously CO because that's going to be part of carbon dioxide. It's called Q. And so this is the volume of blood pumped out of the left ventricle per minute. So it's kind of our volume by time measurement. It's sort of how much blood can you get out into circulation in a given period of time. So it's usually expressed as liters of blood per minute. At rest, in an average sized person, it's probably going to be somewhere between 4.5 and maybe 6 liters of blood per minute. Shockingly, most of you have 4 to maybe 6 liters of blood in your entire body. So in an average person, your blood volume gets circulated through the left ventricle about once per minute at rest. Okay, so those are going to be there. As you can see during exercise, because we can increase both heart rate and stroke volume to different extents, we're going to be able to increase cardiac output maybe 4 or 5 times. So if you're a 5 liters per minute at rest person, maybe you can go to 20 or 25. If you're a super elite athlete and you're at 7 or 7.5 liters per minute at rest because you have a giant left ventricle, then you might be able to get up into the low to mid 30s from cardiac output. I will show you all an equation in a little bit. We'll look at some things. Cardiac output and its ability to increase is a very strong predictor of VO2 max. Okay, a very, very strong predictor of VO2 max. Pardon? I am talking about the Fick equation. That's right. I have no idea where Fick worked. So I've never bothered to look at it. I don't know. It probably wasn't even an exercise physiologist. It's probably just an actual sort of cardiologist. Okay. Okay. So that's what's happening with cardiac output. Why is this not going? Boom. So we're going to talk now in a fair amount of detail about individual physiological or hormonal factors that control heart rate and control stroke volume, and therefore will control what's happening with cardiac output. Okay, so there's going to be some combination of these things that are all going on simultaneously that will determine what your cardiac output is right now. It will determine what your cardiac output will be during walking, during jogging, during maximal exercise. Okay, so we're going to start off by talking about heart rate and the things that we use to regulate heart rate. So we mentioned on Monday that the intrinsic firing rate of the SA node is somewhere between 70 and 75 beats per minute. So we're going to be kind of right in that range, okay, for most people. However, if you look at people that are very highly aerobically endurance trained, they may have resting heart rates that are down in the 30s or the 40s. You will occasionally, if you can really get a person relaxed, see them in the high 20s. Okay. Or if you've got people that are very sedentary or really kind of stressed out, they maybe have resting heart rates in the 90s or 100 beats per minute. Okay. So the question is, if this is the intrinsic rate, what do we got to do to get it to fall to here? Or what also is happening that might raise it to about right here? Okay. The other cool thing about heart rate that we will, and I'll show you some graphs about all of this, is that during exercise, heart rate tends to increase in direct proportion to exercise intensity. So it increases in direct proportion to energy expenditure, right? Which is why every one of you that has an Apple Watch, your Apple Watch measures your heart rate. You have a Fitbit, it measures your heart rate. The easiest way for us to prescribe the proper exercise intensity without having to follow you around with a metabolic cart during exercise is to look at something called your heart rate reserve and tell you, based upon all of this, your heart rate needs to be 150 beats per minute while you're going to go run. You need to run fast enough to put it right there and keep it there. Okay. So it's a really good way for us to estimate exercise intensity. Also, heart rate goes up really, really quickly. Okay, we could have Gabe stand up, do some jumping jacks. His heart rate's going to go up and level off within about 10 seconds. Okay, there's not a lag in heart rate in the way there is a lag in VO2. Okay, you guys remember oxygen deficit? There's really not a heart rate deficit. Okay, there's a very tiny little one on the front end, but it goes up very quickly, which tells us that whatever it is that rises up your heart rate is going to get released and have an effect very, very quickly, unlike the things that are necessary to increase. We got to mess with PFK and PDH and Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. It's just sort of this much more one-to-one kind of thing. Okay. Other things to keep in mind. I'm sure almost all of you have seen this before. We all have a maximal heart rate that can be reached, either during a pharmacological test or while watching a horror movie or doing some kind of all-out, very, very high intensity exercise. The general equation for calculating that is 220 minus your age. Okay, 220 minus your age. This will become important a little bit later on. We'll show you guys why stroke volume is so important, because if you guys are all the same age or roughly the same age, you all have roughly the same max heart rate, which means theoretically you all have the same ability to increase your cardiac output via heart rate to roughly the same extent. I'm the exception because my old ass is, I'm already down like 20 beats per minute from you guys in max heart rate. So that's going to be a problem. All right. So 220 minus your age is one. There's some other ones, which like 207 minus 2/3 of your age. You get roughly the same answer. We're scientists, right? We're never happier than we're taking something that works perfectly well and trying to revise it to make it infinitesimally better in some way. Max heart rate is generally stable with training. Generally stable with training. Okay. In some instances, people that are really, really well trained can't get to their age predicted max heart rate because we kind of max out some other things first. Okay. In general, it's pretty stable with training. So you can't, in much older individuals that are very highly trained, it may have some effect on raising their max heart rate in them, but we gotta, that's a separate question for a separate lecture. Okay. Okay. So how do we regulate heart rate? Primarily, it is regulated by the net input of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system to the SA node. Okay, to the SA node. These things are going to the autonomic nervous system stuff is going to originate in the cardiovascular centers, and we're going to get epi and norepi that are going to increase heart rate, and then acetylcholine from the parasympathetic that will decrease heart rate. Okay. You have large numbers of sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons that are going to be innervated in atria, whereas the ventricles only seem to receive sympathetic input almost exclusively. Okay, almost exclusively. When you are at rest, generally you have very low amounts of sympathetic nervous system input, and you may have, if you are nice and calm, you may have a significant amount of parasympathetic input. And so what happens is I withdraw epinephrine, norepinephrine, that lowers heart rate. I add acetylcholine on top of all of that, and my net balance is that the heart rate's going to fall. Okay. Whereas if I want it to go up, then I can take away the acetylcholine, that will raise it. And then I start adding epinephrine and norepinephrine on top of all of that, and then that will continue to raise it farther. That's not to say that there's not some acetylcholine that's being released during higher intensities of exercise, and that there's also not some epinephrine and norepinephrine at relatively low levels. But we're talking about, for the most part, the kind of net balance of all of these things. Okay? So we'll ask, Gabe, Sai, you guys talk about epi and norepi yet in your chronology class? What happens during exercise? It goes up. Anyone ever asked you a question about hormones and exercise? Just say it goes up. Unless it's insulin, basically everything else. We made this joke on it. Like everything goes up. Okay? It goes up very, very quickly. And that's going to be a reason that it's going to have some control over heart rate, okay, and contractility of the heart. It's also going to play some role in blood pressure and helping us to kind of shunt blood around where we want it to go. Okay? So I really like this graph, okay? Although it was pointed out to me last year that this is an older graph and this is not the most accurate way to depict this. I do like what's going on here, okay? What you can see is here are cardiovascular centers in the brain, and we're going to have parasympathetic input from the vagus nerve that's going to come out, and it's going to go, there's parasympathetic innervation at the SA node, the AV node, and then the atria. And then we're going to have sympathetic nerves that are going to come and innervate SA node, AV node, atria, but also down here in the ventricles. So the sympathetic input in the ventricles will become important for stroke volume, less so for heart rate. Okay. I like the way this graph looks just because it helps me to kind of appreciate how we're going to balance out everything that's going on. Here's heart rate out of, like, say 200. So we've got a 20-year-old person, let's just say. You've got them at rest. They're at 50% of VO2 max, 100% of VO2 max. So you'll note at rest, we have relatively little sympathetic input and a lot of vagus or a lot of parasympathetic. I'm going to start walking and doing a little bit. So some vagus is going to go away. We're probably adding a little bit of epi and norepi while we're doing that, even though it's not really depicted here. There's going to be some point, kind of as we're nearing 50% or thereabouts, where most of the parasympathetic has been removed. Then we're going to start adding more sympathetic on top of that. That's going to help drive us all the way up there. I swear you're still getting parasympathetic like all the way out to like 70 or 80% of VO2, which is not necessarily depicted in this particular graph, but I like the idea behind all of this, that it kind of helps me to understand in general what's going on. Okay, does that make sense? So you can withdraw something and it causes the same thing to happen as if you were adding something else. And so there's these kind of two things that are going on. Okay, so there's some cool things that happen. All right, you want to see cool things? Ethan, you want to do some squats? What? No, you don't actually get up. I mentioned to Ethan he's going to do squats. I've made his heart rate go up. Something that's called anticipatory response. So central command, we're going to simulate the cardiovascular centers from the motor cortex. You're preparing to exercise. Just mention exercise to people. Boom, heart rate goes up. Conversely, I'm like, hey, we're going to have another pop quiz. Or I was lying on Monday and I'm not going to give you guys your bonus points for correcting your tests. Right? Stress, heart rate goes up. Sympathetic, parasympathetic withdrawal, sympathetic nervous system input, those kinds of things. Okay? So what's going to end up happening, right, is that a lot of the things that are going to regulate this are the same things that are regulating, they're going to regulate metabolism. So hypoxia, increases in CO2, ADP, calcium, increases in temperature. All of these kinds of things are going to kind of help us with this, and they're going to have some effects, kind of dilate stuff out into the muscles. Okay. There's also going to be some peripheral input. Not all heart rate regulation is purely from the autonomic nervous system. There's an ability to do some other things. Okay. There are peripheral receptors in blood vessels, in joints, and in muscles. We generally call these things chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors. Some of them could be called type 3 afferent nerves. Okay. Afferent nerves just collect information about stuff going on out of the body, relay it back to our brain in some ways in the midst of all this. Chemoreceptors will pick up things, right? Chemical things that are going on, pH, CO2, O2, those kinds of things. Mechanoreceptors are going to sense force or movement or sense of position. Okay. And input from all of these things generally are going to modify, like, so as these things kind of move and you go up, then you're generally going to remove parasympathetic and increase sympathetic outflow. So we can try to get the proper both cardiovascular and respiratory responses. We'll worry about respiratory responses next week. Okay, so heart rate's pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, a little bit of input from here and there. That's what we got. Stroke volume, on the other hand, stroke volume's weird. Okay, it's much more complicated. But in some ways, because of those complications, it's more important. Okay, it's going to be more important. So we're going to take the things that are going to contribute to stroke volume. All of these things are working together, all at the same time. Okay, we're going to take them one at a time. And so we'll go through sort of a list of these things, like what is it that can affect preload, what can affect afterload, what can affect contractility, what can affect heart rate. And as it turns out, some of these things will interact with each other, but all of them will be at some place, okay, at any given moment in time when you're at rest or when you're exercising or when you're stressed out, and that will contribute to what your kind of net stroke volume is going to be. Cool. All right. Josiah, have you ever heard of something called preload? Josiah's a no. Okay. It's a no idea of preload. Elise, have you heard of preload before? Yes. Remember what it is? Very good. Okay. Preload is in essence end diastolic volume. Okay. It is end diastolic volume. How much blood gets back into the left ventricle before we get a contraction? So let's talk about what those things are going to be. Okay. I called it end diastolic volume. Sometimes people will call it end diastolic pressure. Remember, there is a relationship between pressure and volume. As the volume of blood goes up, the left ventricle is only so big. As more blood goes in there, pressure rises. They're kind of the same thing. Okay. So what you see here on the right would be a Frank Starling curve. Okay. It is ventricular end diastolic volume on the x-axis, and then ventricular performance, or think of this as the force of ventricular contraction. Okay. Remember, the heart is like skeletal muscle. It generates force. And so what you can see is this, it's not exactly linear, but it's kind of this positively kind of curvilinear accelerating function here, that as ventricular end diastolic volume goes up, as it gets higher, then we're going to get greater ventricular performance. Okay. So what happens is that when I fill and I put more and more and more blood into the left ventricle, like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle has connective tissue in it. Okay. Muscle has a little bit of give to it. It's got its own connective tissue. Okay. So I can stretch that cardiac muscle, right? I can stretch it, not a bunch, but I can stretch it some. So think of the left ventricle like a balloon. Okay. You blow air into the balloon, stretch it out, pressure inside of it goes up, then you release that balloon and the air shoots out. If you put a bunch in, if you really stretch it, you get a much more forceful sort of release of air out of those things. Same thing happens in the heart. Okay? When I fill and I stretch the left ventricle is going to do a stretch shortening cycle, just like skeletal muscle does when you want to do, say, a jump, right? You're going to jump, you're going to sink. I'm stretching in the quads, I'm storing elastic energy, and I jump, okay, and I release all of that. I fill the left ventricle. If I get enough in there, it's going to start to stretch. It stores elastic energy. So then when it goes to contract, it is going to give me additional force. This is called not a stretch shortening cycle, even though that's exactly what it is. It's called the Frank-Starling law or the Frank-Starling mechanism of the heart. Frank-Starling mechanism or law. The more I stretch up to a certain point, the larger my stroke volume is going to be. More stretch leads to a more forceful contraction. And as you guys will see, force of contraction matters. Okay? So increasing preload can lead to increased stretch in the left ventricle or any of the chambers, really, which will then increase my stroke volume. Okay? So if I make your preload go up, your stroke volume is very likely going to go up. So how do I make my preload go up? Okay, what's the best way for me to do all of that? Okay, so if I increase cardiac output, okay, if I increase cardiac output, then that is very likely going to increase something called venous return. Venous return is how much blood is coming back into the heart from the superior vena cava at a given point in time. Okay, that's venous return. Okay, when cardiac output goes up, I'm shooting more blood out. It's going to push more blood back in. It's just kind of push-pull on those things. Okay, greater venous return is going to lead to greater preload. More blood is going to get into the left ventricle, more is coming back in. Okay. Additionally, if I increase your blood volume, if I increase blood volume, that increases venous return. You're going to notice a theme here. Okay. The main way to make preload go up is to increase venous return. Okay. You guys want me to make Brady increase his venous return right now? Brady, stand up. Do some jumps like this. We are increasing your venous return by something called the muscle and the thoracic pump. Veins are squishy. And we haven't really talked about veins, but veins are very squishy. So in doing that, when you contract the muscle generates force, increases pressure around the veins in those muscles, and it squishes the veins down and it forces the blood back towards the heart. So that's called the muscle pump. Additionally, there's what we call a thoracic pump. You take a big deep breath in, you lower intrathoracic pressure. As that pressure falls, there's less pressure on those large veins that are going to be in there, so the pressure inside the veins falls, which makes it easier for other venous blood to get into those big veins. So these are going to be things that can be there. All right. If I magically gave all of you guys a pint of blood right now, gave you an infusion, I made your blood volume go up, that would also increase your venous return. Okay. Posture affects venous return. Okay. What do you do when you feel lightheaded? We lay down and put our feet up. Why? You get more blood back to the heart, greater venous return. Okay? You're lightheaded, you feel sick, there may be an improper control of blood pressure and blood flow to the brain. So you put people in rescue position. Lay them down, prop their feet up. We had this experience in our lab like 3 weeks ago. Right? A person that did not feel great. Right? We laid them down, propped their feet up. They eventually felt a little bit better. What? They're not in this room, Gabe. So everybody's done it. Okay. If you do things in my lab, at some point you're probably going to end up on the table with your feet up. So we were just doing some E-stim exercise. And the person hadn't even done anything. They just didn't like.
What she got?
We don't have.
It was the first stem.
Yeah, the person had never really been stemmed before. There was something. So there might have also been some mitigating external circumstances, right? Person might or might not have stayed out too late and engaged in some other types of activities that could lower their blood volume and various things. So anyway, so posture matters. Gravity affects venous return. When you're standing, venous return is working against gravity. So when you lay down, you're not having to fight against gravity. I suppose if I hung you upside down like a bat, then it would really kind of help. Okay? It would really help with venous return. So all of these things, and it's a shame in some ways we're not doing the space flight class, but the lack of gravity really does some funky things to cardiovascular function when you go to space, right? It really does some weird things in the midst of all of this. Heart size also matters, okay? If you have a bigger left ventricle, you can fit more blood into it. It will be stronger, therefore you can have a larger preload, okay? And thus potentially a larger stroke volume. And then venous tone, venous tone. The only acceptable use of the word tone in my presence in the history of the world, okay? Tone. Chris, have y'all talked about venous tone or any kind of that stuff in cardiovascular class yet? No?
I don't
Okay.
think so. I don't remember.
Venous tone is rarely ever spoken of, okay? If you guys you filled everything out and you looked forward on some things, right? We know that arteries and especially arterioles have smooth muscle around them, which can contract and relax and can alter kind of their diameter. Veins are not like arteries and arterioles, but they do have a small ability to kind of clamp some things down in there and increase what we call venous tone, which is in essence going to sort of in that particular area lead to some constriction, and as it raises the pressure, it's going to force blood forward, which would increase venous return. Okay, so you can look at these kinds of things here. I just took this. This is all from George Brooks's book, but this is I kind of like this. We need to stretch the myocardium via increased preload to get more ejection. Okay, and so we've got total blood volume can increase that, body position can increase this, change in intrathoracic pressure so that it is going to go down, will lead to venous return. Right, so we've got all of these other kinds of things that can be going on. Okay. So we've kind of talked about these two things. They're going to help with venous return to the heart. I also want to talk about valves. Okay. Have y'all ever imaged a vein and seen the valves in the vein? Watch them flap open and close during a heartbeat. What are y'all doing down there? Y'all sometimes you can't help but see them. If y'all did more femoral stuff, you'd see them in those ways. So I know you're practicing what you need. Just get those things out. Like, let's look at veins today. So veins have valves in them, arteries don't. Okay. And when you look at a vein, the valves are one-way valves. And so if blood is meant to move this direction, it gets to a certain point in a vein and the valves prevent backwards flow, which is good, because if they didn't, all the blood in your body would be in your freaking feet, right? We're working against gravity, you're up like this, it would all fall downwards. And so this prevents backwards flow, which is really good. This is showing kind of the muscle pumps. You've got some blood in the veins, say in the calves. You contract your muscles, that squishes the vein down, increases the pressure here. So pressure here is higher than pressure up here. Blood moves this direction, it gets through this open valve, and then it can't flow backwards. So as you kind of rhythmically contract as you're doing calf raises or something else dumb, then it's going to kind of force blood back to the heart and not be able to come back on into your. Okay. Now let's talk about afterload. If preload is in diastolic volume, guess what afterload is? In systolic volume. Very good. Afterload is how much blood basically is left in the heart. Okay. What it really is it's going to be affected by the resistance to the emptying of the ventricle. Okay, the resistance in the midst of all of this. So we contracted, how much is left in there? If there's more left in there, that's going to tell us then that something has changed to prevent it from to leave. Okay, so increased afterload forces the heart to perform more work. So what that tells us is if afterload goes up, stroke volume goes down. Okay. If you require a certain amount of cardiac output to stay alive, if stroke volume falls, guess what heart rate has to do to maintain cardiac output? It's got to go up. Okay. So that's going to be one of the reasons we said that it makes the heart perform more work. More beats, more contractions, more work. Also, when afterload goes up, that's also going to tell us in a lot of instances, okay, that blood pressure has probably increased. Okay. The pressure inside the aorta or just distal of the aorta has probably gone up, which means that pressure in the ventricle has to go up even more because blood moves via pressure gradients. Okay, it goes from areas of high pressure to areas of somewhat lower pressure. And so if for some reason we're going to go Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom on people, and I'm going to reach into size chest and I'm going to squeeze his aorta and raise his aortic pressure, then his heart has to begin to contract more forcefully in order to generate pressure in the left ventricle that will be higher than whatever I've made the pressure in his aorta. So that blood will then be able to move from high to low pressure and it will be able to go on by. Okay, so does that idea make sense to you guys? Okay, so simply by raising blood pressure peripherally, we're going to increase the resistance to flow of blood, and that can lower stroke volume and make heart rate have to go up. Okay, so very, very high force exercise like resistance exercise, okay, where you're going to do the Valsalva maneuver a fair amount, where you hold your breath, and you contract your diaphragm, it's going to dramatically raise intrathoracic pressure, okay? That tends to increase afterload because the pressure inside the cavity gets so high that blood pressure, like systolic blood pressures during Valsalva can be 400 millimeters of mercury or some ridiculous shit like that, okay, that you would think should kill you, but apparently it doesn't. Okay, so that's going to be one of the things that goes on. People that are hypertensive, chronically hypertensive, are going to tend to have larger afterload. So hypertension, think about it this way. If afterload is going up, your ejection fraction is going down. So people that are hypertensive are going to have lower ejection fractions at any given at rest and at any given kind of exercise. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but increasing preload and increasing preload chronically, which is the thing that happens during exercise. You exercise, the muscle pump goes way up, you jam a bunch of blood back into the heart, stretches the left ventricle. That will cause cardiac hypertrophy. Okay. Additionally, having high afterloads, likely due to high aortic blood pressures, okay, is also going to cause cardiac hypertrophy. But when you're hypertensive, then the left ventricle has to contract more forcefully in order to overcome the aortic pressure. And that leads to something called pressure load cardiac hypertrophy or concentric cardiac hypertrophy. Whereas increased preload, it's going to stretch the heart, and you're going to get what we call eccentric cardiac hypertrophy. Eccentric cardiac hypertrophy is good because the left ventricle gets bigger, the movement, the space gets bigger. Whereas this, in response to increased afterloads and to the high blood pressure, concentric or pressure load cardiac hypertrophy thickens the left ventricle and can make it less compliant, it's less stretchy, and is going to be a sign of a cardiovascular pathology. Okay, we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Obviously not today, but next week. Okay. Dave, you look like you have a question.
Thinking about asking so you wouldn't recommend resistance training that has
has high blood pressure,
Yeah.
I would 100% recommend some resistance training. You just gotta be really careful. I would recommend resistance training in literally everyone. Because if they've had cardiac problems, they're probably sedentary, they're probably at a high risk of type 2 diabetes and things. So having some muscle would be good for them. You just want to avoid isometric exercise. You want to give them some lighter weights and try to be a little bit more rhythmic, especially at first on some things. You want to try to avoid breath holding. You don't want them to do Valsalva, which is hard not to do if you're going to lift something that's pretty heavy. Otherwise, you'll like smash your liver in half or something. So, I mean, I think it's recommended. You just got to be careful. Just got to be careful. Okay. So, can y'all imagine? We haven't talked about blood pressure regulation, but can you imagine if you look at these kinds of things, right? That sympathetic and parasympathetic, especially sympathetic input, okay, it's going to cause vasoconstriction. Okay, sympathetic input to arteries and arterioles causes vasoconstriction, which raises the blood pressure in there. So you take a person that is chronically stressed out, lots of epinephrine going on all the time. Going to have higher blood pressure because they're clamping down those arteries. That's going to, that increased blood pressure is going to lead to an increase in afterload and have some sort of bad effects on the back. Okay, so you do this, you're stressed and you got sympathetic stuff and you're sedentary, so you're not getting these increases in preload from kind of loading during exercise and all of those things. You can kind of get this really bad, which is why everybody has cardiovascular disease. Okay. And then you throw in that we eat lots of fatty foods, body, and it's all of that. So we have atherosclerosis. There's a whole kind of host of things that are going to go on. Okay. All right. So preload, afterload. And then in some instances, a parameter of cardiac function that is somewhat related to and will contribute to both of these things. But it's called contractility. And so cardiac contractility is often defined as the quality of ventricular performance at a given preload at a given heart rate. I would call it the quality at a given preload and a given afterload or something like all of that. But what it really is, contractility is just left ventricular force production, right? Left ventricular force production. So when I need to eject more blood, I need a more forceful contraction. And I may get that more forceful contraction by increasing preload, right, which will stretch it. And then I get extra force from the elasticity from all of that. That would be good. That's going to be an increase in contractility. Or I can get an increase in sort of direct stimulation of the left ventricle by what we would call sympathetic nervous system stimulation. Okay. If I apply especially norepinephrine onto the left ventricle, I can make it contract more forcefully. Okay. And so what may happen is I have hypertension, I have high aortic pressure, so therefore I've got to release epinephrine and norepinephrine to increase cardiac contractility to overcome all of that to try to preserve my ejection fraction. Okay, one way to see some of those kinds of things. That can lead to an increase in contractility. Or I can get increase in preload, so I stretch, I get increase in contractility from that, and then I can add on top of all of that, let's just say, Richard's out and he's running, right? Running like 800, you're just like, no, I'm not fucking running. No, never gonna run. Okay, I'm with you, man, I'm with you. All right, but let's assume that Richard is running, okay? He's getting increased preload, so he gets some level of an increase in contractility from preload. But he's also, as we have already established, he's running, he's exercising, sympathetic nervous system stuff is going up, so he's gonna also then get on top of all of that the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine on the left ventricle directly, which will lead to a further increase in contractility and an even larger sort of increase in ejection fraction, a larger increase in stroke volume. Okay. Now, there's a problem with all of this that we're going to encounter. We probably won't get to it today, but some of you guys may have spotted what the problem is. Okay. So hypoxia, so if you've got, let's say, blockage in your coronary arteries, hypoxia decreases contractility, right? Prolonged hypoxia can lead to acidosis. Acidosis inside the heart can lead to cell death. It can also, if it's being, you're hypoxic, you're making lactic acid because you're hypoxic, that's going to cause angina, but it's also going to further decrease function in the heart. All of that is going to be like, hey, look, I'm having a freaking heart attack. Okay. And then if you get enough hypoxia for a long enough period of time, you can get tissue death. You get necrosis in there. And if you get tissue necrosis, then you just have less, cardiac muscle. So your muscle has shrunk in size. That will also drive contractility down. And so people that have congestive heart failure, they get tissue death. That tissue death is going to lead to a decrease in contractility. That decrease in contractility increases their afterload. They're oftentimes also going to be hypertensive, further decreases their afterload. And you can get to a place where your left ventricle cannot contract forcefully enough to eject enough blood out through the aorta to maintain tissue function everywhere else in your body. Okay? Die, basically. That's how congestive heart failure is going to kill you. Then it has all sorts of, if you've got congestive heart failure, you get back up because you can't get the blood out. Then it begins to back up into the lungs. If it's left ventricle, it's going to back up into the lungs. You get this really high pressure in the lungs, and then you can't oxygenate, you can't breathe. It's a fucking mess, okay, on all of those kinds of things. Okay, so this is going to attempt to try to show you guys, here are our Frank Starling curves, okay? Here's ventricular end diastolic volume, all right? So here's how much blood is in there at the end. And then here's what our ventricular performance is going to be at a given in diastolic volume. And so what you can note is here are people, let's just say, here's basically a person, here's a person that has heart failure that's going to be way out here. This kind of thing right down here is, if you don't have heart failure, then I don't even know what this person is. This person is basically dead. Here's a very unfit person that's going to have heart failure, right? Here's somebody that is maybe mildly trained. Here's a very fit athlete. What you will notice that as I become more and more fit, I get more ventricular performance at any given level of ventricular filling because I get more stretch because from more venous return, because my blood volume goes up, and I get better contractility performance because I'm more sensitive to the kind of things that are going on there. All right. And I tend to have lower blood pressures, so that's going to also be, going to be good. And so what you can notice, the things that are going to make these curves bend and kind of change their slopes and things are all of these things that we've talked about up until now. Okay, so you can map these things out if you want to, if you guys care. I think in Dr. Larson's exercise testing, the theory and application class, you guys do a little bit of these kinds of things, talk about what happens. So I'll end today talking about heart rate and the effect of heart rate on stroke volume. Okay, so here's some wild things that are going to go on. Okay, as heart rate increases, you can remember the graph I showed you, the little picture I showed you on Monday. As heart rate goes up, the absolute amount of time the heart spins in diastole is going to fall. Okay, it's going to fall from like half a second down to like 0.2 of a second. It's going to go down a lot. Okay? If heart rate gets high enough, filling time goes down and becomes so short that your filling time at high heart rates can reduce preload. Okay? There is just physically not enough time to be able to get a full amount of venous return into the individual chambers during diastole. Okay? And so what you can see here, right, is we've drawn these three curves, and these are people that are basically, so this is relative to consumption, which you can see. These are people that have 3 different levels of fitness that are going to be on here, and what we're measuring, this is stroke volume, Here's in diastolic volume, and here's in systolic volume. So we've got preload, we've got afterload, we've got the actual stroke volume output. And these things have been drawn from the averages of all of these individual lines, which represent people in here. Okay. And so what you see from all of this is that as we get out closer and closer to VO2 max, that stroke volume begins to kind of plateau, and in some instances, it even begins to fall. So in diastolic volume may even begin to go back down as we get closer and closer to max heart rates. And what is happening here is that heart rate is so high, filling times are so short, that preload has gone down. And if preload goes down, then contractility goes down, right? And so therefore, stroke volume is going to begin to fall a little bit. If stroke volume falls, cardiac output by necessity may fall, which will then necessitate a further increase in heart rate, which further exacerbates our problem. Okay. So here's some really interesting things. Here we have pre and post exercise training, and we've got measured stroke volume, and I'm pretty sure that this is actually measured stroke volume from aortic catheters in people pre and post aerobic training. What you will notice that, see, stroke volume rises until about 50% of VO2 max, and then it's going to fall as we get out here near maximal, kind of near VO2 max. All right. And so this fall was much more pronounced in our pre-training individuals, and it went down a little bit to a much smaller extent though after training. And so what we can learn from some of this is that our ability to increase the size of the left ventricle with training and some of the other kind of training-induced reductions in heart rate are going to potentially help to offset a little bit of this fall that we're going to see in the midst of all this. But it can, in some instances, your heart rate can get so high that it begins to limit preload. Now, that may not matter for very many of them, right? We don't often, although it's becoming more and more of a thing with high intensity interval training, we don't often exercise at 85 or 90% of our VO2 max for very long. And the people that do that tend to get pretty big training adaptations. So they're going to look much more like this. Okay. But in the 80s, that was a pretty wild find. Pretty interesting. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll pick up with blood and blood vessels and some of those things. We'll pick all of that stuff up on Monday of next week. We probably won't get to the critical thinking questions until not even next week, probably the week after. So you guys have a little bit of time on all of those. So it will not be Monday. Okay.